There's, I guess, a reason why I'm on the panel. I've had experience in delivering a number of major projects from concept through to implementation. I've been involved with the Pacific Motorway upgrade from the New South Wales-Queensland border up towards Brisbane pretty much since the early or the late 90s. I had a gap but then came back, and for the last 10 years I've been delivering business cases and been fortunate enough to also be involved with some of the implementation aspects. More recently, we were successful in obtaining $1 billion from the federal government to support our projects, which we're now rolling out. So we've got two $1 billion projects, or thereabouts, being rolled out between now and 2023. So I've got a fair appreciation of what the federal government require for projects, what their expectations are in terms of funding, the robustness of the assessments that go into these major infrastructure projects. And as mentioned, I've also been the state's traffic advisor for the state of Queensland for the Gold Coast Light Rail for stage 1, 2 and now stage 3. And as you can see, I'm a consultant, so I provide those consultancy services for the state government. Okay, so this option is about building infrastructure. And okay, there we go. So it typically includes projects such as bypasses, motorways, tunnels, anything that adds capacity to your road network at a substantial level. There were a number of submissions made. There was discussions about a western bypass, tunnelling options, essentially things that bypass the CBD. Noting also that there is a large proportion of trips that do have a destination at the CBD, that's what I've noticed. There are options there or submissions relating to the Brooker Highway being upgraded to a freeway standard. The 5th lane on the southern outlet, as well as grade separation or some form of separation for pedestrians to try and cross Macquarie and Davey Street couplet. There were a number of other submissions, but they were the main ones that I saw as common themes coming through. The key thing with this is you need to understand what they're linking. With transport modelling, a lot of these major projects that require a substantial amount of transport modelling to inform the investment. What we have with the transport modelling, I was involved with the motorway upgrade in Queensland, a substantial investment in the year 2000. The modelling said it was going to last to 2050. We're now in 2018 and the motorway's failing, and it's an 8-lane motorway plus 2 to 4 lanes of service roads, so a substantial amount of investment. And what doesn't get often picked up in the transport modelling is something called Induce Demand, and the federal government's picking up on this. So when you build infrastructure and you provide the capacity, it encourages people to use it. People see that as an opportunity. Developers grab onto the land either side of it and they develop it, and all of a sudden there's all this growth that's occurring that was never planned for, and it happens in an unmanaged way, and that's what you don't want. So building infrastructure is good if it's done in a well-planned manner and in an integrated manner with what goes on with your land use planning scheme as well. Okay, some of the benefits of major infrastructure projects. It directly addresses congestion. So it's probably one of the options that has the direct impact in addressing congestion. So you're providing the capacity for the demand that exists today. What it does do though, it does support the notion of urban sprawl. So people will continue to sprawl that residential growth further afield, and people will drive longer, which has other implications. One of the benefits that you can get out of it is you can have the ability to redress the CBD. So if you take a lot of that traffic that's going from the outlying areas into the parking stations, depending on how you design this major infrastructure project with the ramp locations and the directness of those connections to the parking stations, you can actually see a benefit in terms of taking a lot of those trips that are occurring within the CBD and stripping them out and then redressing the CBD with more cycling and pedestrian-friendly components. Again, it's all about carefully planning how you go about this. One of the things that I've noticed from my brief visits, I've been to Hobart a few times as a tourist, is there is a little bit of confusion in my mind about the road hierarchy. Typically you have roads for the movement of vehicles and then streets for the congregation of people and the movement of cyclists and the softer transport and the harder transport. There are a number of corridors here that I see that I can't see that separation. It seems as though it's a mix of everything. It's carrying that through traffic, it's carrying that local traffic, it's carrying traffic going to parking stations. People are trying to cross the road at the same time and cyclists are trying to navigate it, and the bus routes all travel down the same corridors. To me, there needs to be a better separation of that and a clearer legibility for the users of what the road hierarchy actually is. In terms of the costs, the projects that I've been involved with, fairly consistent across light rail and the motorway projects. They seem to hover around the $100 million per kilometre. So these $1 billion projects typically give you in the order of 10 kilometres worth of infrastructure. It's getting more and more expensive. Service relocations, property acquisitions, often where you're trying to put this infrastructure, it's through constrained corridors where the property values are high. Where you have multi-unit dwellings or commercial businesses with long-term leases on them, they also get quite complex when you're trying to acquire those properties. Structures as well, getting more complex in constrained areas with retaining structures and the likes, all add cost to the mix. In terms of impacts, often major projects, there are environmental impacts, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. Residential impacts in terms of the property acquisitions. A lot of people don't see the heartache that goes into the social, the families that get their houses taken off them. I've had to personally go through that process and have people in tears, and it is hard. It's hard to go and tell someone they're losing their home for the better good for the broader community. The other aspect with major projects is that it does have the potential. You're already in a constrained environment that was discussed previously with the topography. Again, if not designed properly, it can be a barrier itself. It can sever communities. If there's not enough structures or opportunities, or if it's a tunnel, it's probably not so bad, but if it's at grade, it needs to have sufficient permeability so communities can still integrate across and migrate across the barrier itself. Project viability. For major infrastructure projects, from what I'm aware of, the majority of the time, apart from Cross River Rail in Queensland, which is 100% state funded at this stage, most projects have third-party funding. So it's federal government or it's a toll road of some sort. So there requires the viability aspect in terms of making sure that it's returning value for money. And state and local authorities will do the same thing. They'll go through the same process. They'll want to make sure that they're getting bang for buck because it's a responsible way of managing the taxpayers' money. One of the, for the project that I just worked on with the benefit cost ratio we had between 1 and 2, this is the $1.03 billion project that we've just been recently successful with. The volumes of traffic that we're talking about to justify a BCR of 1 to 2, which is just, you've got to have a benefit cost ratio greater than 1 for it to be seen as a good project. Greater than 2 is seen as a really good project. We carry in the order of 100 to 120,000 vehicles a day at the moment on the corridor. We experience 6 hours worth of congestion every day, 7 days a week. Queues on the corridor extend between 5 and 10 kilometres on a daily basis. So the congestion and the numbers, when you put those numbers together and you put it over a 20-year horizon, you start to see the numbers come back that you have a return on investment for a $1 billion spend over a 10-kilometre section. So that's the sort of numbers that go into an economic assessment that then result in those benefit cost ratios coming back positively. Whole of life cost. This is quite an important one, this last point. We secure the capital cost. So we get the $1 billion project or the $2 billion project to build that major infrastructure, and that normally does come from a third party that assists. The issue is that that asset has a life. So in 100 years' time, the structures need to get replaced. In 20 years' time, the pavement needs to get replaced. In 50 years' time, the culverts need to all these assets need to get replaced, and someone has to pay for that replacement. Someone has to pay for the upkeep, and then someone has to pay for the replacement. The third party, unless it's a toll road, is not going to come back and help the state authorities and local authorities pay for the upkeep of that asset. And you're seeing that around the world with bridges starting to fall over, and it's coinciding with the fact that they typically have a life of 100 years. And if you look back, they were installed, a lot of these structures, between 100 and 200 years ago. So it's a real problem I think the agencies need to grapple with as well. Okay, so in summation, before I hand over to Anna for the third scenario, I think there is a place for the build scenario. I think it needs to be well thought out. We need to make sure that it's hitting the mark in terms of integrating with all the other strategies that exist, that are in place. And I couldn't support more the case of having an integrated transport strategy in place for Hobart. One thing I will say as a takeaway is, and again a learning, you don't want to be in a situation where you think you're fixing one problem, but all you're doing is creating another. It needs to be holistic.